All right, good afternoon. This week we're talking about stratification. And there's actually two chapters in this book about stratification. So we'll be covering the first one this week, and then next week we'll cover one on global stratification. Most of the stratification that's discussed in this chapter is limited in scope to the United States, right? So I want to kind of point that out as we go forward over the next couple of weeks, right? I guess I could start by explaining what social stratification is and where the name comes from, right? Long time ago, when I was an undergrad, I took a geography class, or maybe you took a geology class, and in that class, I learned what strata were, right? And I remember a little bit of this, believe it or not. But strata of the Earth's crust, what you would learn about in a geography or geology class, um, essentially are the layers, right? So there's I don't remember all the all the things, but to kind of summarize and simplify these things, and you'll probably remember there's what the core, the mantle, and the crust, and even the crust has many layers to it, right? That's what we call strata, right? In those disciplines. So sociology often borrows terminology from other disciplines, and it applies it to the social world rather than Earth, right? So stratification is the process by which those levels, right? And society is actually stratified in a number of different ways. The stratification that we'll talk about the most in this chapter is economic stratification, right? And and so most of us already know, come into this class, that like the United States and lots of other countries as well, we have upper class, middle class, and lower class. Well, there's more complicated ways with many more categories than that to describe the class structure of the United States, right? So, you can add categories and, subtract them. And, some people say there's something called the underclass that's below lower class. That's actually a really important idea within criminology, that the chronically unemployed with very little chance of moving up the class structure, that is kind of separate than the lower class. And you've probably also encountered ideas that there's upper class, but there's like the super wealthy or the elite or something like that. And in a lot of ways, people like doctors and lawyers that might make a few $100,000 a year are very different than Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and our president and things of that sort, right? So that's what stratification is in terms of economic stratification. There are other ways that society is stratified as well, right? For example, race, gender, right? But in this, we will talk about those things, but the main focus of this chapter is on economic stratification, right? And so, just to kind of go through some of these important concepts. Social stratification is a system by which a society ranks categories of people in a hierarchy. You can see how upper class, middle class, race, gender all do that, right? And the next thing that's discussed is the four principles of stratification, right? And you might think that, I have a position in the class structure, you have a position in the class structure. So they are certainly characteristics of individuals, but they're also characteristics of society. We live in a society that has an upper class, a middle class, and a lower class, right? So that's just the idea that these are not just attributes of individuals, but our society is stratified in this way, right? And that's, for sociologists, that's a really important point, right? They're not just a reflection of individual differences, but it's a trait of society, right? And continuing with the four basic principles, social stratification carries over from one generation. And most of us know this, right? If your dads are rich, you're likely to be rich. And your kids, when you have them, or if you have them, right, they're likely to be rich too, right? That's the way that our society works, right? And it works that way through many different mechanisms, right? Many different mechanisms. Certainly we can leave the next generation money through a will, but it also works through the neighborhoods that we live in, right? And if you can afford to live in a nicer neighborhood, you typically do, right? And that means that most of the time you have a good school system, right? And poor neighborhoods don't. And everyone would like to live in a nicer neighborhood, but not everyone can afford to, right? And the quality of a school system is highly correlated with the median household value, right? So you think of all the quality school systems in Alabama, and typically those are in richer neighborhoods, right? And that gives those students a big advantage, right? And will result in them making more money, right? So that's leaving your children wealth and stuff, inheriting wealth is one, and I think everyone kind of recognizes that, and that's easy to see. But buying a home in a nice neighborhood so that your kids can go to a good school system, that's probably one that we don't always acknowledge, right? And of course, your ability to do that is stratified by your race and by your income and your wealth, right? And if you're maybe among the elite or even more wealthy, maybe you don't even send your kids to public school, but instead you send them to private school, right? And that makes it more likely, that later in their lives they'll get into better schools, better universities, maybe private universities, maybe Ivy League places like Yale and Harvard and stuff like that. And that's one more way that wealthy people ensure that their children will also be wealthy, right? And it just happens to work in concert with educational systems, right? The next basic principle of stratification is that social stratification is universal but variable. What this means essentially is that every society that we have ever studied, currently existing, or in the past in the historical record, there has been social stratification. But at the same time, it varies, right? It's not exactly the same, right? Before industrialization and capitalization of countries and stuff like that, social stratification was quite different. Before then we had a feudal society. There were lords and serfs and things of that sort, and that's a different type of stratification than you see in industrialized capitalists. So that's what it means. Like even when we go back to what we believe are the earliest forms of society, and we talked about this earlier in this class, like hunting and gathering societies. There's stratification in hunting and gathering societies, right? It's mostly along the lines of males and females, right? And males have more property. They own the most valuable technology. That's typically weapons, right? And they also get the most valuable cuts of meat when they kill an animal, right? And so you can see in their labor is divided along gender lines, with males mostly hunting and females, right? And which one do you think is more valued in those societies? Well, hunting certainly more than gathering, right? Meat's more valuable than vegetables, right? Yeah, so that's this idea that like, oh, it's universal, but it's variable, right? And we can, you don't have to go way back in time, but you can study social stratification in other parts of the world, and it varies from ours too. To some extent, it even varies within our country from state to state, right? And region to region. That's the third basic principle of stratification. The fourth and the final one is it doesn't just involve inequality, but there are a set of beliefs that justify this inequality, right? And we call those beliefs ideology, right? Those are the set of ideas, the cultural ideas that justify the existing state of material conditions. Who has money, who doesn't, who has property and worldly possessions, let's say, right? And who doesn't. And our system has a system of ideas that justifies this. It also has a system of like stereotypes, right? So most people in the United States are exposed to these ideas, and they convince us to varying levels that like, oh, the rich people, they must be smarter and they must be harder workers and stuff like that. And although that might be true in some cases, it is not always true, right? Some people are just born to richer people. They're not smarter. They're not harder workers, right? And sometimes they might portray themselves as a self-made billionaire. I can think of examples I've already mentioned, right? But why are they wealthy? Well, it's mostly because their parents were wealthy, right? Yeah, so that's ideology, the set of beliefs that support and justify social stratification, right? So it's not just about material things and who owns and stuff and who doesn't, but it's also about these ideas, cultural notions about who's deserving, who's not deserving, how much we should tax people, right, that have wealth, and how much we should tax people that have income, right? All right, and we'll return to the difference between income and wealth in a second, right? This is the point where I need to talk about the difference between caste systems and class systems, right? And this is also the point where, like, what is a caste system? And if you were with me, give me an example of a caste system. And usually when I do this in front of class, like people are like, India is the best example of a caste system, right? And what does that mean to have a caste system, right? A caste system is where your position in the stratification of society is completely determined by scribe statuses that you're typically born into, right? Now, when we talk about, like, there are things that you can't help for the most part, right? And if you know a little bit about caste systems in India, you're born into them. Whatever your parents' positions are in the caste, when they had you as a kid, you're born into that position, right? And at the very top of the caste system, there are Brahmins, right? Kind of a priest class. And these ideas in India are rooted in religious ideas. That's part of the ideology that justify this inequality. And then at the very bottom of that caste system are what are called Dalits, or untouchables is usually the way it's translated into English. And those people are the poorest, and they have occupations based upon their, just like the top are gonna priest class, professionals, and stuff like that. The people at the bottom clean the streets, empty out outhouses, right? Deal with the dirtiest of jobs in society, right? And there are all these notions within that caste system of the people at the top are the most pure, and the people at the bottom are less pure or contaminated, right? And those set of ideas dictate how they relate to each other, right? The reason why they're called untouchables is because every person in the caste system refuses to touch them, and those people are not allowed to touch someone above them, right? Serious norm violation if they do, right? And if a person does come into contact with an untouchable, there will be sanctions, consequences for that, but there are also purification rituals to for that person in a higher position to get rid of that contamination, right? And all that's really important for a caste system, right? And presents all sorts of interesting problems in India, right? I mean, there have been problems in the past with if you're of a certain caste and you're a medical doctor, can you touch your patient, right? And these present problems for a caste system, right? One thing about India is, in most caste systems, is you are expected to marry, and it's only permissible for you to marry someone in a similar caste. So an untouchable cannot marry someone in a Brahmin class, right? Without making that person in the Brahmin class less pure, right? And probably making mad all your family, right? And offspring of that would probably be considered in the untouchables, not in the Brahmin, right? So it's this, caste, you're born into it, and it's transmitted across generations as well, right? And rarely do people marry, although I should say, like, the caste system in India is not as strong as it used to be. It was much stronger 100 years ago, and these prohibitions against marrying are weaker than they used to be, particularly in cities, right? And, I've had friends from India over the years, and I asked them about caste and how it works and stuff like that. Now, a lot of these people, and this is what you would expect because they're educated in the United States, and they're other professors that I know and stuff, they're typically from higher caste. But if you ask them, they'll often talk about these ideas about caste as not being as strong in cities, not being as strong among educated people. They're kind of these superstitious ideas that people out in the country have, right? Country, whatever the equivalent in India of a country bumpkin, right? They have these, but not us educated people that live in the cities and stuff like that. Always thought that was kind of interesting take on things, right? And I think they're right about that, right? All right, so that's caste, right? Now, caste systems don't only exist in other places, right? In exotic, maybe Indian culture and stuff like that, because we had a very strong caste system in the South, right? And we still have remnants of that caste system. It does not work like the caste system in India, but in a lot of ways it does work exactly like this, right? In the South, and we certainly still have remnants of a caste system, but we had a racial caste system in the South, right? You go back prior to the Civil War, and a lot of these practices continue after the Civil War, and some of them you can even see remnants today. We had a racial caste system, right? And you had plantation owners and you had slaves. And slaves, if they were allowed to marry, if they were allowed to breed or have sex and have offspring, that would be with other slaves. And their children would be born into slavery. That's essentially the way that chattel slavery is what we had, right? And there were, just like in India, prohibitions, laws against white people and black people intermarrying. And some of these laws were enforced well into the 1900s, right? So you see that that's called that you are expected to marry, like they call that endogenous marriage, anthropologists do, right? And the offspring of those sexual relationships are born into that caste. You see how that is across generations. It's not just limited to one generation, right? And I listed a number of attributes of India, right? There were also serious prohibitions against black people touching white people, right? Many people in the South, blacks, were lynched for touching the hand of white people or being accused of touching the hands of white people, right? Do you see how that's... And people would believe during those times, and sometimes today, that they have become contaminated, right? They have been polluted, right? It was very unusual prior to the Civil War and during Reconstruction for black and white people to shake hands, right? That's a serious norm violation, right? And I hope that you see that is a caste system, right? And it's based upon race, not upon religious ideas, right? Although religious ideas were used to justify slavery in Jim Crow laws as well. Those religious ideas were part of the ideology of the South, and particularly prior to Civil War and even after Civil War. If you know a little bit about Civil War, like people in the South believed that they were justified, and they pointed to certain verses in the Bible to justify the owning of people, right, of chattel slavery, right? So the whole point of this is like caste system is not completely unknown to us in the United States. It existed here. You don't have to go all the way to India. And there are still remnants of this racial caste system in the South, right? There are still many people that believe, whether they say it openly or not, that white people and black people should not intermarry or date. And that's a remnant of that system, right? So we're still dealing with the kind of fallout and remnants of that system. Now, remember when I said if you ask people about India and their caste system, they'll tell you, oh, that's kind of whatever their equivalent of country bumpkins and uneducated people, right? Now, when it comes to a racial caste system in the South, don't we often say the same things? Like, not in cities, we're not like this, but out in the countryside, there's still a lot of people that believe in a racial caste system, that believe they shouldn't intermarry, that believe that people shouldn't date across races, that black people shouldn't touch white people and stuff like that. Now, isn't that really interesting parallels from a race caste system in the South to a caste system in India, right? And there are differences, of course, but there's lots of similarities as well. And I just kind of always like to point that out, right? And it's also true that that system is not nearly as strong as it used to be prior to the Civil War. It's not as strong as it was under Jim Crow prior to the Civil Rights, and the Civil Rights movement in the South, and Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, and that was a struggle against this caste system, and there certainly was progress. Now, are all those problems behind us? And we left those in history, and now, no, I don't think they're all left behind us, right? But you can answer that question for yourself. I, as a sociologist, still see a lot of remnants from that racial caste system, right? And I see them in my everyday life, right? And I think most people can see those remnants as well, right? All right, that's what a caste system is. Let me talk about, next I want to talk about what meritocracy is. And I want to point out first that there's no true meritocracy, right? There have been people that have claimed that they live in a meritocracy. A meritocracy is when I hope you remember earlier in this class when we talked a bit about the difference between achieved statuses and ascribed statuses. So the ascribed statuses are kind of things that race, gender, what caste you are in India, or what those are things you can't help those. You can't, you're born into them, right? You don't have any choice, right? But achieved statuses are things like our educational attainment, our occupation, right? And those things we can control at least some aspects, unlike the ascribed statuses, right? A meritocracy, if one ever existed, what it would mean is that only the achieved statuses would matter for your position in the stratification system, and all of the ascribed statuses wouldn't matter at all, right? So let's think about that. Do we live in a society where race, gender still continue to matter when it comes to income, when it comes to educational attainment, when it comes to what neighborhood you live in, your accumulation of wealth, income? Of course they still matter. Those patterns still exist in our society, right? Now, what that tells you, or what it should tell you, is that we don't live in 100% meritocracy, right? Now, I don't believe that we exist in a strict caste system like we used to, right? 300 years ago in the South. What it means is that we live in a class system, and in a class system, meritocracy and achievements matter, but they're not the only thing that matters. Ascribed statuses like race and gender still matter, right? That's what a class system is, right? And how a class system differs than a caste system. Caste system is all about ascribed statuses, right? Born into it, can't help it, right? A class system is a mix of ascribed and achieved statuses, and and that's the nature of the system that we live in now, where is both ascribed and achieved matter, right? And I hope everyone sees that, right? Now we might can debate and have differences of opinion about how much is achieved and how much is ascribed, but both of them matter, right? The balance or weight of each of those, we might have differences of opinion, but both of those still matter, right? All right. Yeah. So I think we've kind of outlined a lot of the important vocabularies or concepts at the beginning of this chapter. There's a discussion of like how things existed in Europe under a feudal system, right? In the Middle Ages up till the industrial. I talked about lords and serfs, and in some ways that's fairly similar to what we had in the South. But ideas about race really didn't exist until around 1600s. Right, and they really developed first, and that's kind of the idea of like race as a social construction, right? And they, why was that social construction constructed? Well, we needed ideological reasons to justify social stratification, and particularly the owning of people and the treating of those people like property rather than full individual humans with all the same rights, right? And ideas of race, we think of race and that always existed and stuff. No, right? It's in the long history of stuff, it's only, about 400 years old, right? It develops at a certain time, right? Develops during colonialism, right? And it develops in response to slavery and who the slaves are, what they look like, and the way that they're treated, and how can that be justified? How can people own people and still, despite owning other people and treating them in those ways, still think that they're good people, right? And I hope that you see that ideology, right, that justifies the inequality, right, and the treatment of those below us. That's a very important characteristic of stratification. Was in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. It also is now, right? Because we still have these ideas that, why rich people rich and poor people rich, and is that fair? And what amount of it's fair, right? We still have these ideas about that. Now they vary, right? There's not as much consensus as there probably was in the past, right? And of course they vary depending upon your position in the social stratification system, I point out to you, right? I would also point out that some of our most important thinkers, like Karl Marx, and he's trying to wrap his head around stratification between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie during the emergence of industrialization and how they treat each other, what the class relationships are. I mean, that's Karl Marx's entire theory, deals with that, right? With that inequality, right? Feminist deals with, inequality and class position based upon gender, right? W.E. Du Bois deals with stratification, right, by race, right? So all of these ideas, sociologists have always been, you know, involved in asking these questions, understanding how social stratification works, and how the ideology that supports it works too, right? Yeah. Now, earlier I said there's been what did I say earlier? That stratification is universal variable. There have been times when people said that we are going to create a society that's no longer stratified, right? This happened in USSR, right? You know, it is a communist goal to have a society that doesn't have proletarians, doesn't have bourgeoisie, where we eliminate all inequality, right? That is the stated goal of the revolution within, Karl Marx's ideology, right? His entire theory, right? And that is what, at least the stated goals of USSR. Did they ever achieve it? That utopian vision of a classless society? No, they didn't, right? If they did, that would have been a meritocracy. And I told you no meritocracy has ever existed, right? They just created a different type of stratification. So there was those that were connected to the politicians at the very top, and there were those that didn't, right? The peasants that were still, picking wheat and stuff, right? Our factory workers. And then there was, the families and the well-connected, the people that were close to the top of the political hierarchy. And they got different food, they drove different cars, they had nicer apartments and houses and stuff like that. So they still, there have been attempts at creating a utopian communist, but there have not been any, class. There's never been a society, and it's kind of difficult to imagine that there will be one in the future that's completely devoid of any type of inequality, right? Now, maybe I could be proved wrong in the future, but it's kind of hard for me to imagine a society with no inequality. At the same time, do we have to have this much inequality that we have in the United States? And I don't think it's not an all or nothing, right? We certainly have had an American society that was not marked by as much inequality as we currently have. And we have lots of inequality, in the United States right now. There have been times in our history when we had far less than we have now, right? All right, let's get to these theories about, inequality and the thing that I mentioned earlier about all societies have some stratification, some inequality, right? Although it's variable, right? So when structural functionalists look at all of the societies that exist now and have currently or have existed in the past in the historical records, and they see that inequality is universal. It exists in all those. That's the cultural universal, right? And when they see a cultural universal, structural functionalists always assume if it's universal everywhere we look, there it is, that it must serve some function, right? And so this is the Davis Moore, and they're structural functionalists, Davis and Moore, right? And they say that some jobs should be paid more, right? And that's because they're more functional for society. And they give the example of medical doctors. And I think it's, take note that the occupation they picked to demonstrate their argument, right? Because I think it works pretty good for medical doctors. I'm not sure it works really well for a lot of other occupations, right? So I think there's a reason why they picked, right? And here's how their argument goes, right? So we need medical doctors. They help our society function. They take care of our health, and we value our health in our society. They help us live longer. Our lives have less suffering in them because of that, right? And we need our best and our brightest members of society to be drawn into these occupations, because medical school is difficult, right? It's difficult. It is long. It takes years and years to get a college degree, and then to go to med school and go through all that's required to become a doctor. And those are years where they could be spent making money, right? But eventually, if they do that, they're successful, they should be rewarded with very high incomes, and they are, right? And what this is supposed to demonstrate is that all the jobs that are high paying, they're more functional for society, and that's why they're high paying, right? I think that works really good for medical doctors. I'm not sure it works really well. I'm not persuaded when we start thinking about all sorts of other occupations and other forms of inequality, right? Maybe I'm a little bit biased. My mother was a school teacher, right? And she taught in the high school that I went to, right? School teachers are not paid enough, in my opinion. Are they functional for society? Certainly, I think everyone would agree, right? And if you provide an important function for society, according to Davis Moore thesis, you should get paid more, but they do not, right? And I could think of other occupations like I don't know, people who manage hedge funds are some of the highest paid people. Does that mean that they're doing the most functional jobs? No, not at all, right? Yeah, and so I think, Davis and Moore, they pick medical doctors because it lends itself to this argument, right? But we can think of all sorts of occupations where, like, we'd just come to the collision. Social workers is a good example. Very functional for society. As far as professions that require a college degree, they're often very low, right? Yeah. We need them, and we should pay them more, but our society does not reward teachers, social workers, in a way that's consistent with the valuable functions that they provide for society, right? So I think that's kind of, you have a whole theory that's supposed to explain inequality, but it only does it for medical, but not all these other, probably not a real good theory, is it, right? That's how structural functionalists explain inequality and social stratification. I don't think that's a real persuasive argument. It's not for me personally. It might work for you. You might be persuaded. I don't know. So next, let's move on to conflict. And we've already talked a little bit about this, right? Karl Marx is a great example of a conflict theorist. And his theory is about class, economic stratification, right? He says all conflict theories, there's two groups, and they don't have the same interests. They compete over scarce resources, right? They're not equal, right? And for Karl Marx, those are the bourgeoisie at the top of that hierarchy and the proletariat at the bottom, right? They don't have the same interests. They're not rewarded the same. Most of the profits go to the bourgeoisie. The proletariat, they get poorer and poorer and poorer, right? And that's a huge injustice for Karl Marx, something that demands change, demands a revolution, a restructuring of society, right? And Yeah, and so those are the two classes. That's how they're not equal. They are in a struggle against each other, according to Marx, um, and he offers a utopian vision of a classless society, right? Um, and uh, half the world at one point lived under communist ideas. They were heavily influenced by the ideas of Karl Marx, and no matter what you think about Karl Marx, um, his ideas have had a huge impact, right? I mean, name another sociologist that um, their theories changed half the countries and the way they were politically organized. There's not another one, right? But Karl Marx, we can say that, right? I mean, the entire globe was kind of divided up by capitalist countries and socialist / communist countries at one time, right? And still, to some extent, largely is. Although those ideas don't have as much influence as they used to, right? All right. I should point out, I should point out some problems. Like I kind of praised him and said his ideas are really, but there are some problems, and these are mentioned in this chapter too, right? Karl Marx predicted revolutions, and he predicted that they would happen really in all of the Western European countries, the countries that industrialized first, right? Should have more inequality between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And those conditions will be so horrible for those people, the proletariat, that they would overthrow the means of production, right? And they would have revolutions and, right? Those are not the countries where revolution occurs, right? We have no communist revolution in France, England, UK, Germany, right? Instead, what we see is communist revolutions in poorer countries that have not industrialized, countries that are still back in agrarian, right? So you see communist revolutions in China, Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Latin America, South America, Central. And that is contrary to what Marx predicted, right? He thought industrialization is going to create this growing, and that would be the engine of communist revolutions. Well, that's a pretty big prediction. He's wrong about that, right? So that has led a lot of people that like neo or post-Marxists, like, why isn't there a revolution in these countries, and why is there a revolution in these other countries, right? That becomes a new set of questions that followers of Karl Marx, and there's some kind of interesting, the use of propaganda and ideology are one explanation for that. The use of police to disrupt workers' rights and unions and their ability to organize and things like that. That's another reason why maybe we don't have those things, right? And police are often used to kind of bust up attempts at unionizing, and there's a long history of that in the United States, and a long history of it in the South, right? And that one explanation for why we don't see revolutions in all these highly industrialized states, but we do see them in the agrarian, the low income countries or states, right? Right. Now we're going to talk about Max Weber, and it has been said that Max Weber is engaged in a debate with Karl Marx, right? What that means is Max Weber, he was writing after Marx was dead, right? And he's influenced by Marx's ideas, but he believes that things are considerably more complicated. Karl Marx has a relatively simple theory, right? Even as the way that societies, it's like there's two groups. There's bourgeoisie and there's proletariat. That's just kind of simple, right? Max Weber comes along. He's like, Marx is right about some things, but he's wrong about others. It's much more complicated than he would lead you to believe, right? So you're not completely agreeing with him. You can't say he's a follower of Marx. But at the same time, he recognizes that he has some good thoughts, but they're often kind of simple. And he's not really wanting to dismiss everything that he says, right? But he kind of wants to tidy up and improve some of the original ideas that he had, right? And so Max Weber comes up with he says it's not just you own and control the factories or you work for the people that own and control. That's Marx's ideas, right? He actually says that we're stratified based upon three things. He calls this a tripartite system of stratification, meaning there's three things. There's not one like Marx suggested, right? And they are class, status, and power, right? Our class is our economic position, right? Our status is our social standing, right? And our power is largely related to politics, our membership in political organizations, right? Power is defined by Weber, and it is pronounced Weber, not Weber, right? He's German, right? So you get these strange. And he says that power he defines it as the ability to overcome the wishes of others, right? And if you can achieve your goals and your objectives despite the wishes of others, that means you have more power than them, right? And that's typically done within politics, right? And so that's you see how that's more complicated. You see how he's like class. That's pretty similar to what Marx was talking about, right? So he's arguing with the ghost of Marx, right? He's like, you're right about this class, that one part of stratification, but there's these other two things as well. There's social standing, which is our social standing, and is mostly related to your occupation, right? The people with certain occupations, we kind of look up and admire those people, and other occupations we don't. We do kind of look down upon them, right? Yeah. And there are some people, I suppose, that have high status but don't make a lot of money, right? Teachers, maybe professors, maybe sociologists, right? Don't make a whole lot of money, but we have relatively high status. People, I guess they admire us sometimes or look up to us or something like that. And, maybe social workers are like that too, but we don't get paid much, right? That's Weber's, and that's a conflict perspective as well, right? I'm going to talk about conspicuous consumption, right? And these are the ideas of symbolic interactions, because we're kind of going through these three theoretical approaches, right? When we talk about symbolic interaction, we're talking about how people interact and how people use symbols when they interact with each other, and demonstrate through the display of symbols that they're this type of person versus this type of person, if they're high up in the class structure or low, right? And there's symbols of this, right, that are believed to matter the most, right? And so, Karl Marx talks a lot about production and like whether we, work for the factory or we own the factory or something like that. Symbolic interactions don't talk as much about production. Instead, they talk about consumption, of goods. That matters a lot more to symbolic interactionists than it does to Karl Marx, right? And they talk about conspicuous consumption, right? Conspicuous consumption is the buying and using of products because they have a symbolic value, right? Because they say something about your social position, right? And so, because we all live in a society like this, that the meaning of driving a luxury vehicle, BMW, Mercedes, something like that, or maybe even more exotic and rare and expensive car, it's often that means something about you. You're the type of person that does that. You're, successful or whatever, right? That you're of high social standing, right? And the same is true of certain clothing and, designer brands and, And these things matter. I mean, think about high school and like people that wear all the brands and drive the right kind of car and stuff like that. That often translates into how popular they are, right? Whether it should or not, doesn't matter, but it often does, right? We live in a materialistic, consumption-based society, right? Whether you like that or not, we do, right? And, and how do we figure out people's position in the social structure? Well, typically we look at symbols, all the things that they consume, consumer goods, car they drive in, clothes that they wear, what zip code they live in, what neighborhood they live in. If you're from, I don't know, Mountain Brook, that says something about you, right? And that's different than if you live from, I don't know, Montevallo or trying to think of the Black Belt or a place like Selma or something like that, right? We have stereotypes about people from there, and that says something, and sometimes that means a lot to people. I don't know if it means a whole lot to me. I don't drive a luxury vehicle, and this is not a very expensive shirt, right? But that probably tells you where my class position is, right? It's not as high as those people, right? And so that's what we call conspicuous consumption, right? That we have so much, that some people have so much money they can spend it upon frivolous things. They can buy purses that cost $5,000, right? They can drive vehicles that cost $300,000, $500,000, right? So you see how that's based in consumption, right? This is also the point where I usually talk about this genre of music videos, right? When I was younger, maybe in the 90s, early 2000s, most people my age at that time loved to watch videos. This is back when MTV actually had music videos on it, right? And I noticed there was this new genre of music videos that was becoming incredibly popular at that time. And it was associated with rap videos, right? And rap videos prior to this did not look like this, right? But after a certain time, almost all rap videos in the late 90s, early 2000s were full of conspicuous consumption, right? Here are the symbols that you would see. Very large gold chains, multiple gold chains, right? Like thick, like that big around gold chain, right? You see how that's a symbol of conspicuous consumption. They would typically be on yachts, right? They would be surrounded by beautiful women, often in bikinis, right? And if they weren't on a yacht, they would be driving or standing in front of, posing in front of supercars like Lamborghinis and, just like ridiculously expensive cars, right? And they would often have all the right name brands, and they would rap about these name brands. And you still see some of that today, like rap music about name brand goods and stuff like that, right? Well, that's all what symbolic interaction is called, the display of ostentatious display of wealth, right? And here's another thing that they would often do, and this is ostentatious display of wealth at its best, right? We all know this thing, and there's a saying for it: make it rain, right? And you would see people with a big wad of dollar bills and go like this, sometimes in a strip club or something like that, right? There's no better example of ostentatious display of wealth than holding up a stack of dollar bills and just, I'm so wealthy, this doesn't even bother me. I can just give it away, right? Here's another example, right? Oftentimes you would see this image of people lighting cigars with $100 bill. I don't know if you've ever seen that, right? That is the ostentatious display of wealth. Popping champagne bottles of Dom Perignon, very expensive champagne, and being so careless that you just pour some on the ground or pour it on your head or, on a girl's head or something like that. That you're just like frivolously consuming, wasting this, right? Yeah, that's that is ostentatious display of wealth. And why are they doing that? Well, they're wanting to impress upon people that I'm this wealthy, I'm this successful of a rapper that I can do this, right? I have so much money that I can just throw it around and give it away and stuff like that. And it doesn't even, bother me. I'm smiling the whole way through it, right? Yeah. And you see that's all about consumption, right? And that's all about conspicuous consumption, the ostentatious display of wealth, right? Now that's a really exaggerated example of those things, rap videos and on yachts and supercars and gold chains and making it rain and stuff like that. But that's you see less exaggerated. If you look at people that live in wealthy neighborhoods, they drive certain cars, they have certain types of purses the women do, they get plastic surgery, breast augmentations, and that signifies to others that I am wealthy, I have made it, right? And that can help them marry people that are wealthy, that can help them get jobs, that can help them make more money, right? Yeah. So it has this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy kind of idea to it, right? Wow. I hope you find my stories interesting about ostentatious display of wealth and rap videos and stuff. I think we can explain that, right, as sociologists, right? There's a lot of other interesting stuff in here. I don't know if I want to keep you that long. In fact, I'm running out of time, right? But there's some other important ideas, but I wanted to kind of introduce you to the main ideas, the main concepts, and I wanted to step you through all those theoretical approaches. I'm going to stop this video. I do expect you to read the rest of the chapters and learn the rest of those ideas on your own. We do have a test this weekend, and I'll get that posted later today. I hope everyone is doing well out there. I hope you've enjoyed this video, or at least tolerated it to some extent. And yeah, after this week, we will cover global stratification, and then we'll have our spring break. And I hope y'all are looking forward to that like I am. Have a good day.